Well,
All
John
those,
Nichols,
all,
welcome to the program.
it's an honor to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's an honor to chat with you. I've seen your face so many times on Democracy Now! And different places like that. So to actually catch up with a reporter that you've been following for some time is always a bit of a weird experience, but a cool one for me. And reading the book that is coming out very soon, it was also a bit of a strange experience because you're writing about a period of shock, use that term, dislocation. And there's episodes there that are like, oh, I kind of remember that. Like, so much of that early time of the COVID period was really just trying to make sense of what's happening. So doing this accounting and who profited from it is really valuable. But I wanted to start sort of there about and ask you a little bit about your own experience as a reporter during that sort of initial period of shock and dislocation. How did you kind of experience the pandemic and try to make sense of it as it was quickly coming at you?
Well, you, in your question, just summed up pretty much why I decided to do the book.
Hmm.
Because I realized very early on that this was going to come at us fast and hard, and it wasn't going to stop. And as a result, we were all but assured of losing track of what was going on, and frankly, very vulnerable to being lied to about a lot of stuff, and forgetting a lot of stuff. So I decided pretty early on that I was going to take notes. I was going to keep track of it. And as you know, I am a reporter and a writer, so I interviewed a lot of people. And even as I was interviewing people in the early stages of the pandemic, I kind of kept a second file.
Hmm.
I was like, I do my articles and that, but I kind of kept track of what was going on with an idea toward writing a book. And the basic concept that I wanted to explore was a question of whether we actually learn anything from past experience. And your slight giggle there suggests the problem, because the fact of the matter is we should have known exactly where it was headed. We should have known the problems, and we should have been much better at dealing with it. Naomi Klein wrote The Shock Doctrine, right? We've been taught about disaster capitalism. We've been taught
a while ago
about
too, and we've been talking about the book for a long time, so it's no surprise.
no, it shouldn't be. And also, I mean, we had the economic meltdown of 2007, 2008, which taught us all sorts of stuff about how not just politicians, but also corporate types take advantage of the moment, right? So, with all of that understanding, it should have been in a society that learns from its experiences, should have been a circumstance where we did better. In fact, it became clear very early on that we were going to do worse. And some of it was down to Donald Trump. I mean, you can, and I write a lot about him in the book, and it's very easy to blame him for everything. But it's Trump is just a symptom of the problem. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we have a system, and I read a lot about the United States, somewhat about the world in the book, but we certainly have a system in the United States that that pretty much doomed us to an awful response to the pandemic. And that response was so awful that the Lancet study suggested that as many as 40% of those who died in the first year didn't have to die, that it wasn't necessary. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people getting sick and a substantial number dying unnecessarily. That ought to be a big deal in any country at any time. And so it was with that understanding that I set out to write the book.
So, I think using the concept of the shock doctrine is really quite apt. And I'm curious, like knowing of the idea, knowing of the term, and having an eye towards how disaster capitalism might manifest. How are you thinking about that at the moment? Like, having that in your head, where does that lead one?
I mean, right now.
No, in the early days.
In the early days. Oh, very well. Naomi Klein herself did speak about some of this. She wrote an essay relatively early on in which she said, look, watch out, because there's certain things that could happen if we don't do things right. And I have, for many years, written a lot about and interviewed Bernie Sanders. And he and I spoke at great length several times in March and April of 2020 about these precise issues. And so at the time, I was A, very conscious of it, and B, I guess the best way is that I had a sense of foreboding. Mm-hmm. I am actually a pretty optimistic person, a pretty upbeat person, but I've covered politics for too long, and I've seen these circumstances in too many ways. It just seemed to me that we were going to see the shock doctrine writ large, that everything we saw in 2008, 2009, 2010, we were going to see in a much more profound way. And when I say profound, it's because there would be more money involved. And by the way, there is, right? I mean, if you think about it just in the context of the United States, Canada, same, similar situations, the outlays of government capital, right, of money that was made available were just astronomical, far more than during the economic meltdown. And at the same time, the potential for a redistribution of the wealth upwards was even more astronomical, because we were going to have a lot of needs. We were going to have a supply chain challenge that was going to be altered because, the physical task of getting things was going to be different. So those who were digital and delivery oriented, i.e. an Amazon or something like that, they were just going to make unimaginable amounts of money. And then the final component, which actually should be the first component, is that because of these first two realities, that politics was going to be politics, and it was going to go in some ugly directions, and that could be exploited by capital. We were going to end up in a situation where a lot of people died that didn't need to die. And so I had a lot of foreboding early on. And my initial writing was in this area. I started writing a lot about frontline workers who were in very difficult situations. One of the first sets of stories I did was on bus drivers and train drivers, because there was simply no question that they were in a terrible circumstance. They were in an awful situation. And a lot of the first people who died were bus drivers and public transportation folks, because they were under pressure to get folks to where they needed to go, right? I mean, they didn't get to take off, and yet we hadn't put in the basic protections for them. And so by the nature of it, they were, as one bus driver said in a poignant essay, because he ultimately died of COVID, that essentially buses were, cruise ships on wheels. They were, you brought all these people in, you brought all the ailments in, and if there wasn't adequate protection, the bus driver is going to be there the whole day, right? Encountering everybody who gets on. And in fact, such was the case. And so I wrote a lot about that early on. Also started writing a lot about nurses early on. And also people working in factory settings who were sometimes doing incredibly heroic work, making respirators and things like that. But also people who were forced to go to work in factory settings, often very closed, constrained settings, right? Without a lot of protection, to do things like make lawn care products, right? In winter.
Yeah.
They weren't essential workers. The only thing that made them essential was that some corporation wanted them in that factory so they could make money.
Your book starts poignantly, I think, with a factory worker, assembly line worker named Mike Jackson. Could you tell me a little bit about him and why you decided to start there?
Sure. Mike Jackson goes right to what we were just talking about. He's a guy in his 40s. He has a large family, African-American guy working in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or in his case, just outside Milwaukee in an industrial suburb. And he worked for a company called Briggs & Stratton. And his work was considered essential, right? Now, in fact, he was making products for blowing leaves off your lawn and things like that. I believe. I won't describe it too precisely, but essentially that's what he was doing. But he had to come into work. And very early on, Mike Jackson said, as did a number of his other workers, we're not well protected here. This factory setting that we're in, we're working across from other people and we're breathing right at them. They're breathing at us. We're moving around without a lot of kind of even what they already knew in those early stages were baseline protections. And they raised complaints. They through their union and as individuals, they said, this doesn't look good. Well, lo and behold, in very short order, COVID hit the plant. Mike Jackson got sick, and he went home. He was taken out, and went home. But he had a large family to support, and there was a lot of pressure. He did not want to lose the job. He did not. He felt pressured, and he went back into work. And he was never diagnosed in the early stage. So he's back in work, kind of falling through the cracks of our healthcare system, pressured by our economic system to work. And he ultimately collapsed, in his workplace. He was taken out, he got into a hospital, but he did die. And why his story stands out for me, it's a lot of reasons. I mean, it's a classic story of a lot of the challenges. He didn't need to die. He shouldn't have died. He shouldn't have been working in that factory then. That factory should have been shut down then. It wasn't necessary at that moment for him to be there. But beyond that, it was a wake-up call. Milwaukee's an industrial town. There's a lot of towns like it across North America where a lot of people work hard in factory settings. And it was clear that there were going to be others like him. And there were in the meatpacking industry and in other factory settings. But also what happened in Milwaukee was compelling because a group of activists made a big deal about the fact that he died, and they made him. I don't want to say a symbol because I think that's somewhat diminishing. They made him an icon in a way. They said, here's a hardworking person from our community who didn't need to die. And we should remember his story, and we should remember his circumstance, and we should grow and learn from that. Mm. And they were in the streets. They protested. They made a big deal about it. And especially his name kind of floated into the broader political discourse a little bit as the year went on, because we had a big battle about whether corporations could be held to account for deaths in their workplaces. And some members of his family stepped up and said, we think we should be able to sue over things like this, or at least we think we should be able to demand accountability, where we had politicians like Mitch McConnell or was in the Senate, saying, no, we have to have liability liability shields for corporations. So without getting too complicated about all this, the bottom line is that Mike Jackson's story intersected again and again with sort of all of the deep politics and the deep economics of the COVID crisis. And so that's why I started with him. And in most of the chapters in the book, I tried to find an individual who died or who got very sick that didn't have to. And then what I try to do is to trace through, who could have saved them.
That liability shield part, I mean, accountability is a huge theme in the book, but the kind of legal chicanery that's going on there, it comes up in many different chapters. People are sneaking in liability protections, or they're delaying certain legislative moves because the liability shield is a kind of necessary feature for them and their corporate benefactors. Can you tell me a little bit about where else that surfaces?
Oh, I mean, you're right. It's writ large across the book because it's the liability shield is the place where sort of disaster capitalism, again, something we've talked about a bit in this conversation, where it erects its protective shields. It's the moat, if you will. It's what it allows corporations to do whatever they want, knowing that they're not gonna run into particular challenges. And that's because in the United States, as in most countries around the world, we don't have a lot of accountability for corporations that let workers die and that let workers get sick or that work them in unreasonable ways. Now, unions can sometimes play a real role in protecting, but there's a lot of bad situations that occur. And when they occur after the fact, if you have the ability to sue, if you have the ability to go into court and say, hey, here's the evidence that this corporation did the wrong thing, that they didn't protect these people, that they didn't protect consumers, you can, ideally force them to pay. Now, that doesn't begin to satisfy the needs or the reality of the circumstance, because you've got people who've died or people who've gotten very sick. But what it does do, the power of the liability shield, or of liability, of the ability to sue, is that you can let corporations know that if they do not take care of their workers, if they do not take care of consumers, they can be held to account, right? They could end up in trouble. It could cost them a lot of money. They care about things like that. So what Mitch McConnell, who was the main power broker in the United States Senate at that point, did was hold up relief, hold up aid for people who were suffering until he could get a liability shield. And this is an incredible thing in American politics, not well covered, but from the late spring, early summer of 2020 until winter, like months passing, at a point when we were having thousands of people die every week, rising to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of infections. Our government, our federal government, wasn't acting. It wasn't taking the basic steps. Now, the House of Representatives had passed a bipartisan bill to act, right? Democrats and Republicans had agreed they were going to act. And Mitch McConnell said, nope, not going to do it until we add a liability shield, till we protect the corporations. Months passed. Finally, things got so bad with the huge surge in late 2020, early 2021, that McConnell backed off. And they did not do the full liability shield that he wanted. But that just proves, I think it shows how powerful corporations are, and frankly, how determined the politicians who serve those corporations are. Because even in the midst of a pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people are dying, millions of people are being infected, there were politicians who said, oh, can't do anything, can't help until we get the corporations protected. And I think it's, again, it sums up the crisis. And as I wrote about it during 2020, I could just see, you could see the pieces falling into place and the reality of the challenge. And it was just one of many examples of where had we had a different leadership, and frankly, a different system, a system that was more conscious of human suffering and the need to respond to it, we could have saved immense numbers of lives.
Same thing on the liability question. Cuomo, right? Liability protection for nursing homes. Do I have that right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York.
Yeah.
And
there's.
Yeah, I would just say that he snuck liability shield stuff in at a critical stage, and it was such an emergency moment that people initially went along with it. Even people didn't think it was a good idea because they're like, oh, we just got to get this. We got to get aid out. We got to help people. But in Cuomo's case, it was, if anything, even uglier, because it wasn't just that he was protecting corporations. In many senses, he was protecting himself, because he had made decisions about putting people who were infected into nursing homes that clearly caused disastrous circumstances in New York State. It's one of the, Cuomo is now the former governor. He's forced out because of a series of charges against him as regards sexual assault or sexual harassment. I think harassment being the better word there. But beneath that, there was a sub-story that had he not been forced out for that, there were many people in the New York legislature who felt that he should be forced out because of how he handled the nursing home issues, not just the liability shield, but also some of the mandates and orders that he made that were just disastrously ill thought. And then the fact, finally, that he sought to cover it up. He went out of his way to try and prevent people from finding out what he and what, corporate folks had done.
It's maybe hard for people to remember now, given how far he's fallen, but at the time, your book reviews how much of a media darling he was, and some of the statistics of over 70 super majorities of New Yorkers thinking that he's doing a good job. What was it? How did he convince people, a super majorities, that he was doing a good job?
Sure. Cuomo did what is sort of and I read a lot about media in the book, because I think media is always a factor in all this. He did what frankly smart politicians have learned to do in the modern age. They recognize that we've had sort of a collapse of a lot of our local media. We don't have as many reporters doing journalism. This is true in the US, it's true in Canada, it's true in countries around the world. And so as a result, there's a void there. And as a political leader, if you step up and do daily press conferences, right? If you really put yourself out front and do so in an aggressive way, you can basically own the story. And that's what Cuomo did. Now, to his credit, he accepted the reality of the pandemic in ways that Trump did not. So while Trump was kind of incoherent in the first months of the pandemic, some days saying it was like World War II, we've got this incredible challenge ahead of us. Other days saying, it's nothing, we'll be back to work by Easter. He was whipsawing in his own mind. He was not taking it seriously. He has acknowledged to Bob Woodward he was actually lying to people about it. So you had this kind of incoherence on the part of Trump. And then here you had Cuomo, daily press conferences, very sophisticated, very well presented with video and audio and a team of people with him. And it became a reality in the United States that almost every day, Cuomo's press conferences were being broadcast live on our cable channels. So millions of people, not just in New York, but across the country, were watching him. He wasn't afraid to pick fights with Trump on some things, and that was good. And so as a result, he became such a heroic figure in the early stages that there was even talk of replacing Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee for president, moving Cuomo in because he's this younger, dynamic figure who seemed to be on top of the issue of the day. And it was only over time that you realized that while he was actually doing some good things, he was communicating well about it, that he was also playing politics with it. And this is a guy who had taken huge amounts of money from the healthcare industry, huge amounts of money from the nursing home industry. And he was, even as he said good things publicly, behind the scenes, taking steps, taking actions that were damaging and that would ultimately ended up creating a circumstance where people died that didn't need to die. And again, that becomes my sub-theme of the book. When we talk about accountability, there's a lot of reasons we hold people to account. You can, take money, you can, have bad policies, but ultimately, to my mind, if you've taken steps, if you've done things where it can honestly be said people died that didn't need to die, well, that's the point at which, I think you sort of pull the brake and say something's wrong here. And to the immense credit of a lot of people I interviewed for the book, including a state legislator in New York, a liberal Democratic state legislator named Ron Kim, they were willing to call him out. And it wasn't easy. In some cases, they were brutally attacked, criticized in media and by the political class, but they did turn out to be right.
Well, it's such a polarizing media environment. If you're seen to be attacking someone like Cuomo, then are you enabling Trump? And so people kind of, mum's the word, One of the other figures in the book, this is one of those that it's like, oh yeah, I vaguely remember that. But Jared Kushner was responsible for importing PPE in a project called Project Airbridge, which you describe as a classic Trump scheme. I'll just read it here. It provides multinational corporations with no-bid contracts that guaranteed them federally funded air transportation and fast tracks customs clearance. And then you quote Trump's, "These are massive planes, by the way, big planes, very big, powerful planes, and they're loaded to the gills with supplies." Totally forgot about this, but how did Project Airbridge, tell me a little bit more about it and how did it turn out?
Well, I'll get to the end of the story first because it's the fun. It crashed and burned, right? It's like it was a total disaster. But let's back up and ask why it was a disaster. Well, that's easy. You put Jared Kushner in charge, and the one thing that I try to recount in the book is that Donald Trump wasn't a politician. He came to power because he figured out how to take control of the Republican Party, which wasn't hard, and then to prevail in an election cycle, not with the majority of votes, but with a minority of votes in the right places. That's in a way sort of a lot of the pathologies of our system. But he became president of the United States, and the weird part is he got in there without a lot of friends, without a lot of longtime contacts and allies, and so he didn't trust a lot of the people who were around him. Even people that when he staffed up, that's why he kept firing chiefs of staff. He keeps firing people. It's constant. It's like, he at one point he left one of his chiefs of staff, Reince Priebus, on the runway at an airport. They didn't tell him he was fired. It's just when the motorcade pulled out, they didn't take Priebus, right? And so this was how Trump was governing. Now, in this chaotic approach, a lot of things went awry. But when you hit on COVID, of course, then it gets serious, right? This is life and death issues. And Trump did what he had done throughout his administration. He turned to Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and put him in charge of something major. Now, I wrote detail in the book. Kushner was already in charge of, Israel, Palestine peace negotiations and, environmental things. And I mean, the list was endless. It was like anything Trump didn't want to deal with and didn't trust anybody else to deal with, he gave to Kushner. So suddenly you got COVID, and Kushner gets put in charge of essentially the supply chain. And the idea was, we didn't have enough PPE. There were literally cases where nurses were using garbage bags to protect themselves because, they just didn't have the equipment that they needed. And people were dying as a result of this. And Trump knew this was looking bad. And so he puts Kushner in charge. And instead of doing what would be so easily done in the United States, we have a Defense Production Act. We literally could have said, look, factories that are making, other stuff, you got to start making PPE. It's easy to do, right? And, or if we're doing importation, that we literally set up a clear channel where it's coming into government warehouses and we could do it. But Kushner didn't do that. What he did was he basically requisitions a lot of planes, right? And says to US corporations, if you find a company in China or Vietnam or someplace else that's making something, we'll let you have the plane. You can load it up with stuff. You just bring it into the United States. We're not gonna hassle you at the border. You're gonna get in, come in easy and stuff like that. And then if you promise us that you'll kind of try to get some of it to useful places, we'll let you have the rest of it, right? And that's what they did. They literally had these corporations, were bringing stuff in, and instead of a really systematic, smart way of distributing what they got, they were selling it off, to the highest bidder and moving it to places that were the most convenient for them. And so we ended up with a double hit. We spent a ton of money and we didn't get the supplies we needed at a critical stage. Now, Trump tried to suggest, and Kushner tried to suggest that, overall it worked and the private sector was doing good and stuff like this. But it was such a mess that this program that was started in the spring of 2020, by the summer of 2020, was under multiple congressional investigations and legal concerns, legal investigations, and they folded it. They just gave up on it ultimately because it was a disaster. And why I highlight it is, of course, it's a good story to tell, but there's also something else. It's, to this day, we have supply chain problems, right? It's a big issue. And I'm not blaming Kushner for all of that. But what I would point out is that if we had focused on this early on and really said, look, this is going to be a long-term pandemic. This isn't something that's going to go away in short order. We really need to get this stuff right. We, A, could have saved lives. B, could have saved a lot of money that we could have put into other necessary tasks. And the weird part is, I interviewed for the book. There were people saying it at the time. People like Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio saying, we need to be doing this stuff. And they frankly weren't being listened to.
I'm curious about why this approach. Like, was it ideological on Kushner's part? Was it profiteering? And maybe this is too difficult to question, but to do some sort of like historical revisionism, is it conceivable that he might have chosen differently, and that Trump actually might have gone that route of the Defense Production Act and did a kind of right populism or nativism to kind of get the country making all that PPE, or was this a kind of fait accompli?
Oh, that's a brilliant question, because it gets us into it puts us on two tracks, both of which are really important. Number one, what was going on with Kushner? What was going on with Trump? They were clueless. They didn't take advice from people who knew what to do. Kushner was literally taking advice from college roommates and stuff like this. They were looking at this huge challenge and they were kind of responding to the last person they had talked to, rather than a serious approach. So yeah, they were clueless. I'd love to tell you that it was pure profiteering in their case. There was certainly profiteering, but I don't think that was what this was about. I think that in this case, I would argue that Kushner didn't know what to do, and so he and having Trump's imprimatur defaulted to the notion that the market will solve everything, and we'll just throw it out, and we'll throw a lot of money to corporations, let them deregulate them in a lot of ways. Let's be virtual libertarians here, and we'll see what we get out of this, right? And what they got was a disaster. So that's one. That's an attempt at an answer to the first part of your question. The second part of your question is where it gets really interesting, because I think you're onto something that's huge, and I became very conscious of this as I wrote the book. Look, we had an election in 2020. Most of what Trump did wrong during the course of 2020 was, some of it was just personal hubris, but a huge part of it was he was afraid to get defeated for re-election. And so he decided that he was going to basically try and deny the crisis sufficiently that he could get reelected, because he could go back to talking about the things he wanted to talk about. The economy is doing pretty good, stuff like that. And had he gone another route, had he said, look, this is a huge crisis. It's a terrible circumstance for our country. People are really scared, but they're also really united, right? There was it was pretty broad-based fear of what was coming at us. And if he had then said, look, this is our number one job. This is what we've got to do. This is our Pearl Harbor. This is our variation of the economic meltdown or the Great Depression. Pick your reference point, right? And he said, we've got to all be focused on this. One nation, united together. Anybody who criticizes me as a horrible player, he could neutralize those who disagreed with him, but he could also open up the treasury of the United States, and just start, printing money to do things, right? And he could have taken care of a lot of Americans, right? Got resources out to them in a very difficult situation, taken care of a lot of businesses, gotten a lot of healthcare to people, Could have done all that and made himself, I think, very popular.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he could have claimed a kind of a heroic position, if you will. Now, it would have been cynical, right? Of course, but it might well have worked. And frankly, if he had done that, if he had simply chosen to do what was the right thing, right? A full response to this, get everything that needed to be done, but also the politically smart thing, in my opinion, would he have been reelected? I think the chances are very, very good. And so in a weird kind of way, he screwed himself over by kind of overthinking it. He should have just responded, done the right thing, and it might well have helped him politically.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. If he had the sort of gumption and the wherewithal and the vision to say, you know what, we're going to go head on this. Here's your Trump vaccine. Here's your Trump mask. Yes. Here's your Trump checks. He probably would have won. I've also wondered myself, and reading your book, there's sort of two things that I would say against that possibility. The one, the rampant corporate profiteering throughout the book, right? So does his kind of alliance of corporate interests allow it? And second, and this really comes up in the chapter where you talk about Rahm Emanuel and you talk about sort of Clinton Democrats and things like that. Does the administrative state, to the extent that it still exists, can it even achieve it? So even if he wanted to, could they pull off kind of like a managed economy approach and really kind of stem the tide of the crisis?
It's a very good question. I think that Trump would have had to do something that I think some people anticipated he might have tried to do at the start of his presidency, but it turned out he never went that direction. And that it was to kind of jettison the sort of Paul Ryan economic conservative types, right? Yeah. And go with a certain sort of corporatism, right? That created a lot of jobs and that made some companies, some companies did well. but wasn't necessarily particularly great for the investor class, and wasn't necessarily particularly great for a lot of the economic institutions and individuals that have tended to support both major parties in the country. So yeah, it would have been, there are elements of this that would have been a break with the political and economic elites of the country. And I don't think Trump is capable of it. I mean, as we talk about this, we're speculating, right? Yeah. We're talking about how one might have dealt with this. And I think the answer is, there's a better answer. And it comes from a very different direction. And that was in 2016, Bernie Sanders ran for president of the United States, promising a political revolution. And he would say very bluntly, if I'm elected president, for me to govern, there's going to have to be a political revolution. We're going to have to really do things very, very differently. And I would dare say that had Bernie Sanders won, which he didn't, right? But had he won in 2016, was he in the presidency in 2020, right? And had he been able to implement a lot of what the vision that he had, if you had a national healthcare system that was obviously it'd be nascent, but it would be up and running to some extent. If you had a different vision as regards corporate monopolies and how you deal with corporations and that, could you have responded to this better? Yes, absolutely. But I don't think that it's likely that a Donald Trump would have, suddenly just jettisoned all of the sort of systemic pressures. And I actually think, because of as people know, I'm pretty critical of the Democratic Party. I think that you might well have ended up in a situation where there were Democrats criticizing Trump for going too far if he had, tried to do some of these things. And you would have ended up with the usual sort of dumb partisanship. So it didn't happen. I guess that's the roundabout way of saying it is. Could there have been a better route? Absolutely. It's within the realm of possibility. But I think you would have had to change some systemic things before, not in that moment of emergency.
We cover education a lot on this show, especially higher education. So I wanted to ask you about another character in the book, Betsy DeVos, who people know as a fundamentalist, sort of charter school advocate. How did she sort of take this opportunity, this crisis?
Oh, yeah. Well, she gets a chapter, obviously, and education figures in the book a lot. It's something that obviously became a very big deal because our schools were closed, and there was a lot of passion around those issues. There still is, but it's an ongoing challenge. I have a teenage daughter, and in fact, it two teenagers in our house during that time, and it was challenging, right? So, I mean, obviously, everything comes into play. And what Betsy DeVos did that was fascinating was that instead of trying to make education work, right? And by the way, there's a lot of examples from around the world where they did do incredibly good jobs. And obviously it's maybe a smaller scale, but the Prime Minister of Iceland, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, I've interviewed her and she's spoken brilliantly about, how they kept their schools open by reducing the number of students at any time in the school. So instead of having all the students come in, they would have the teachers and a small group of students coming to meet with their teacher for an hour or so each day to get lessons, to have a little bit of instruction, to maintain that some sort of community, and then heading home, right? And using a lot of digital, a lot of virtual stuff. And that model, they had schools closed for a time, but they were able to, make it function. And it was doable. Instead of doing, like a really sensible approaches or trying different things, as teachers' unions in the U.S. suggested, DeVos tried to use a hammer. And basically, she would go on Fox News and say, if the schools don't reopen right now, despite the fact that we don't have the protections that are needed, despite the fact that teachers are legitimately concerned, if they don't do what we tell them to do, then maybe we should start looking to move the money away from public schools and over to private schools that are open. And so she went almost immediately to her great passion, which is privatization of public education, privatization of schools. And it was, again, it's funny in our conversation here, again and again, we come back to, well, they did exactly what we thought they would do. Well, she did exactly what you would think she would do. It's almost like it's so predictable that it wasn't even surprising, except that you had real alternatives at the time. This is the bottom line. The teachers unions in the United States, especially the American Federation of Teachers, they were saying, look, we're ready to work with you. We're ready to find ways to do virtual education for as long as we can if we need to, but then to get back into those schools, but do it in the safest possible way for the students, for the teachers, and for the community. And they were not treated with respect. They weren't drawn into the discourse in the way that they should have. And then DeVos sided with some Republican governors like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who really were just brutal in their approach. Just saying, we're reopening. Who cares? This is just what we're going to do. And there was a lot of, Florida was not as disastrous as some people predicted it would be, but, there are cases from around the country, I write about it, of teachers who died. And again, cases where people died that didn't need to die. And Betsy DeVos was exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong time to be in charge of education in the US.
Are there school districts that refused and lost out federal funding?
No, by and large, because of it was a narrow window.
Yeah.
And so, and DeVos threatened this. And the reality is that a lot of school districts did open up. They kind of, it wasn't just DeVos. She didn't have the full power. Most of our education in the United States, it's important to understand, runs at the state and local level.
Right.
And so what DeVos was really doing was backing up the Republican governors who were trying to open. And at the end of the day, there were definitely cases where there were threats. There were definitely cases where school districts reopened, I think, that did not want to. But you didn't get to that level of a wide scale, cutting of the federal funding and shift to the private schools. Had Trump been reelected, then I think that might well have come to a head in the very early stages of the Trump second term. And so, my book is very, very critical of Donald Trump for a lot of things. And one of the things that became very clear to me was, if Trump had been reelected and he had seen through his approach up to that point, many of the things that were horrible would have become genuinely disastrous. Because I think that, we talked a little bit about how Trump might have come out ahead politically had he done a better job. There was also the possibility that had he survived having done a bad job, that I think they might have, really sort of dug into that approach deeper and done it more and leveraged some of the pandemic, in ways that would have allowed them to achieve long-term goals, like privatization of education.
On the question of profiteering, privatization, when you review the top line numbers of just the enormous transfer of wealth and billionaires made out like gangbusters, like $1 trillion of wealth gain from the 651 billionaires. It's hard to comprehend that kind of number. At a top line level, what exactly was it that made these billionaires' wealth rise so much?
Sure. Well, let's I have to update the numbers. The book is out, or will be out in a few days, but there's a little bit of a gap between when a book gets finished and when it actually goes to press. The basic premise is there. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But I can tell you that recent studies from the Institute for Policy Studies and Americans for Tax Fairness show that during the pandemic, billionaires, not that many of them, but the people who are billionaires in the United States, their numbers increased from, I think it was something, and in fact, I've even got it, I keep it around here just on my desk, from 614 to 745 during the first 18 months of the pandemic. So you had an exponential increase in the number of billionaires, and their wealth went up by 2.1 trillion, a 70% increase in their wealth, right? So this is just, jaw-dropping. These are the best of times for billionaires. And how did they do so well? Well, because remember we talked before about, had Trump really gone into using the Defense Production Act and forcing manufacturing and other sectors of the economy to bend to this reality, right? To say, we're in a crisis moment. We're not going to have profiteering here. It's what Roosevelt did during World War II. He said, look, we're going to still have the private sector doing stuff, but you're going to do it under our direction, and you're going to do it in ways that, you'll make a little bit of money, but you're not going to make excess profits, and you're going to make sure that you deliver the products we need. Had you organized the economy in that way, which was highly successful during World War II, then you wouldn't have had this kind of like massive transfer of wealth. But what we ended up with was a situation where we freed up a lot of federal capital, right? We had a lot of money going out for loans to companies and grants, essentially, all sorts of tax breaks and other things. And what happened was that those who were already very, very wealthy were the first in line to take advantage of it. I write in my book about, like anti-government groups, right? Groups that are highly critical of the US government that were first in line. Oh yeah, I need my check to, help me stay open, right? So we propped up, the baseline operations of all kinds of businesses, and we did something incredibly beneficial to the investor class, right? The investor class could move its money, obviously, around to where there would be profits, right? And you saw, a lot of the tech companies boom. You saw obviously Amazon boom. Elon Musk and his operations boomed. A lot of money flowed into them. A lot of money was made. And so we created a situation that was just, if you came into the pandemic with a lot of money, if you were an investor and you could move your money around and kind of make bets, oh yeah, we're going to have a lot of stuff delivered, or we're going to need a lot of masks, I'll invest in it. It was great for them, and there was no limit on the profit that they would make. And the final thing I would say is that our approach to some of these things, it comes back classically with Amazon, is that if you could figure out how to make a lot of money during the pandemic, the sky was the limit, right? And you could fire whistleblowers, Amazon did. You could bust unions or block unions, Amazon did. And that's just the top line. That's the one you know about. There's all kinds of other companies that did the same thing. And so we effectively gave billionaires a blank check to rely on the federal government to shore them up wherever they needed, if they had a little bit of a burden or anything, there's federal money there, but B, to use the money that they had and invest it wherever they wanted in the US and abroad, and just to make a fortune.
So the last sort of theme I wanted to ask you about was accountability. I mean, you talked about the extra hundreds of thousands of people dead because of terrible policy decisions. We've talked at length about people along the way stalling things, profiting from them. And so you want to see accountability. I've never seen that in my lifetime in U.S. politics. I mean, the Iraq War and the torture memos and the financial crisis. I mean, it's such a foreign concept to me that it seems almost too fanciful to comprehend. So what would it look like for you if it were real?
Yeah, what a great question. And look, I have a chapter and you've been so generous in your reading of the book and your referencing of it. You know that the final chapter is all about this, and it's about impunity, right? That a lack of accountability leads to political and economic elites thinking they can do whatever they want, right? That they're not going to be held to account. And in America, that's writ large across our history. I mean, we had a civil war. And then we erected statues to the losers all over the country, and we let the people who were on the wrong side of a civil war, essentially after a brief period of reconstruction, walk away and run the territory that they had always run. And so, as a country, we have a long history of letting people off the hook, and we let presidents off the hook. Richard Nixon avoided impeachment in 1974 and flew off to California and began immediately kind of repositioning himself as an elder statesman. Ronald Reagan avoided accountability for the Iran-Contra scandal, which was, astounding. And Trump, because of our the way our system operates, avoided conviction after being impeached twice. So presidents get off the hook. And if you think it's true with politicians, boy, it's writ large, double in corporations. By and large, corporations which have their hooks into both political parties tend to, have very, very little accountability. And so, what would it look like? How could you do this? Well, the answer is that there are a few examples in our history of how it's been done, and probably the best example was Franklin Roosevelt, and during the Great Depression. When the Depression occurred, and this is one of the biggest things, I talk about this a lot because I think this is something that we need to understand. In the United States, and I think in Canada, and I think countries around the world, we tend to think of really bad things that happen as sort of natural disasters. Like, oh, economic meltdown, natural disaster. COVID, natural disaster, right? They're not. I mean, they are developments that may have been unavoidable, right? And they may have components of them that are that result from natural developments as regards our health, things like that. But at some fundamental level, they're disasters that are made dramatically worse by a failure of accountability. And when the Great Depression occurred, initially Herbert Hoover was president of the United States, and he was basically relatively laissez-faire. He was sort of like, oh man, something bad happened. We really hope it sorts out. Well, things just kept getting worse. And Hoover tried to intervene in some ways, but pretty miserably. And he was defeated for re-election, and Roosevelt came to the presidency. Around the same time that Roosevelt was coming to the presidency, senators were starting to realize, boy, this is bad. We're going to be in trouble for this, too. So they started to step up, and they started a commission in the United States Senate to investigate who was responsible for the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression was global, so these weren't naive people. They didn't think it was only, like somebody pushed a button and the Depression happened. But they were basically saying, who made the pain as bad as it was? Who made things worse than it was? Who did things that had they not done what they did, the whole circumstance would have worked out better. And it was called the Pecora Commission. They actually hired a guy who had been a lawyer going after the mob in New York City. And because they looked at bankers and the financial sector as like the mob. And Pecora was fearless. He was a remarkable guy. He was born in Italy, raised in, I think, Hell's Kitchen in New York. A tough guy. And he came into that committee and he called in bankers and CEOs, names that you would know, and put them in the chair and said, why did you do this? And here's the evidence of what you did. And out of the Pecora Commission, there were prosecutions, convictions, withdrawals of licenses. And it was profound. It had a huge impact, and it captured the imagination of the United States. They didn't put every banker in jail. They didn't put every investor in jail. That wasn't the case. But it was clear that through that accountability moment, they identified the people who had made things worse. They took bankers off the pedestal, right? They took the financial class off that elite position, and they said, no, these are bad people who did bad things for their own self-service, and you cannot let them return to their positions of power in the way that they operated. And the fascinating thing was that out of that accountability moment, you drove policy. That's where we started to regulate banks in the United States. That's where we started to regulate finance in the United States. Now, tragically, much of that was undone by Bill Clinton. And so I'm not saying we're in some perfect situation, but, in a brief and I think very positive period, an accountability moment led to prosecutions and, fines, but also to a change in policy. And that's what I argue for. I argue that, and I would argue this strongly, I think in the years since Joe Biden became president of the United States and Democrats took charge of the Senate, they've squandered an accountability moment. They have not done what they should have done. There should have been hearings. They should have had top prosecutors looking at these issues, not merely to punish. This isn't just about punishment. This is about figuring out why things went as badly as they did so they would never go that badly again. And I would argue that that's still what they should do. I despair because I fear the Democrats don't have the guts to do it. But I will tell you that we need a Pecora commission of our time. And we need it because of something else that I write about in the final chapter of the book, and that is the power of addressing public opinion. Because accountability exists in a lot of places. Accountability can be a criminal indictment. It can be a civil suit. It can be a governmental intervention, a censure, an impeachment, or something like that. There's a lot of forms that it can take. It can be regulation of corporations. It can be taxation. You can do a lot of things. But the most powerful accountability of all is in the court of public opinion. If we can identify people, maybe a class of people in our elites as bad players, right? As folks who should not be in power and shouldn't be given the leeway that they have had. And the great example of that was at the start of World War II, Michael Foot, and who went on to become a leader of the British Labour Party. He was a young journalist, and he and some of his friends, after the crisis and everything that related to Dunkirk, they took all the files on all the British leaders who had been appeasers of Hitler during the 1930s, and they wrote a book called Guilty Men. And they had a series of chapters that identified these people and identified what they said, and made an argument that what they did and what they said with appeasement dramatically weakened and harmed Great Britain in that moment. And the simple truth is that many of those people that they identified were written out of politics. They could never come back. And that was what Foote wanted to accomplish. And frankly, that's what I want to accomplish. I'll be very blunt with you. I hope that in writing my book and in talking in situations like this, that we can begin to identify the people who failed us horribly during the pandemic, and to say they have no place in our politics. And frankly, they have no place running our business sector as well. And they ought to be held to account. Some people want to punish them and do all that. I'd be quite satisfied if they just couldn't come back and do it again.
That's a good place to end. I wanted to talk to you about Biden and where we are with the story today, because it strikes me that now we're in this period of sort of recalibrated or lower expectations after a series of legislative losses and, just a kind of resignation almost. But even at the height of Biden's appeal, I guess, where there was a discourse that he was going to be a transformational FDR-like political figure. I remember we did an entire episode long ago around the theme of a return to normalcy, right? I mean, that was really always the pitch. It was never what you just said about, let's actually call out the people who wreaked this havoc upon us and banish them from the world of politics because they should never return. But it strikes me if he would have taken that tone, it would have worked probably. Why do you think he didn't? And where do you see Biden more broadly, sort of in this story of the response to COVID-19?
It's a terrific question, and so let's start at the end of it, and then we'll circle around to your core question, which is the really vital one. Look, I think that Biden, who I've interviewed and covered for a very, very long time, I think he's well-intended. And I think that distinguishes him from Trump. I think that Trump was not well-intended. I think that Trump was a damaged man, a mess of a human being who couldn't even begin to worry about other people. He was obsessed with his own circumstance, his own political trajectory, and frankly, financial trajectory. And so he was exactly the wrong president at exactly the wrong time. Biden's better than that. I think he's a more humane person. I think he's a person who's been through a lot of personal trauma, loss of family members in some pretty tragic circumstances, has a lot of experience, does know the power of government to do good and bad, et cetera. And I think by and large, he's leaned in a better direction. And I'll give him that without a question. But I'll be very blunt with you. I don't think that that with that said, that his handling of this has been what I would like to see. I don't think it's been sufficient. And you got to the heart of it with that, why wasn't there accountability from day one? Why didn't on January 20th, Joe Biden, who has control of Congress too, why didn't they move immediately on something that would have been so easy, which is a deep accountability moment where they actually investigate and get to the heart of the matter? There could be revelations, jaw-dropping revelations on a regular basis. I found them very easily in my book, and a human side of this. And so they didn't do that. I think that was an error. I think I was glad that Trump got impeached for what he was impeached for, but I don't know why they didn't throw on an article of impeachment for how he handled COVID. It's absurd that you don't have accountability when you have this level of people dying and this level of malfeasance. And so they failed on that. I think also to some extent that the Biden administration was hopeful about getting beyond the pandemic and didn't do what they should have done, which is, you should, this pandemic, if it teaches you anything, is you ought to be conscious that it's not going away fast and that it's very likely to come back and haunt you again. And so I think that there should have been much more of a focus on the long-term challenges. And I know Americans are tired of this, and they're sick of it. They want to be done with it. But the reality is that I think that there was a period, especially in the summer into the early fall, a lot of focus on Build Back Better, a lot of focus on other negotiations, but not a focus on, let's realize the pandemic is still going on. It is still a threat. And I think that's had an impact now on his approval ratings with Omicron hitting and Biden's. I think Biden's been hurt a little bit by this. And so you ask yourself, why wouldn't somebody as smart, and I think Biden's smart, and I think the people around him are smart, why wouldn't they do better? And I think that gets to the heart of the matter, to this reality. Joe Biden's a man of government. He's a man of the modern Democratic Party. He's been a Democratic elected official for more than 50 years. He was 36 years in the U.S. Senate, 8 years as vice president of the United States, 3-time candidate for president of the United States. This is a guy he's a lifer. He's a permanent man of government. He raises money for politics in the way that they all raise money for politics, with a deference to the corporate side, with a deference to the elites. And he works within a Democratic Party that thinks that way. Doesn't mean that he isn't better than Trump by any measure. He is better. Doesn't mean that he isn't more humane by any measure. He is more humane. But I think that he too frequently has colored within the lines of the existing system rather than to go outside of those lines. And while some of his rhetoric was about building back better, to do things really differently, the reality is that there has not been a sufficient break. And I will go back to the core theme of my book, which is that the only way that you get the kind of break you need is if you have accountability. Without an accountability focus, it becomes virtually impossible to move policy at the level that you want to move it. And so I would argue that if Biden had focused on accountability from day one and made that really central to what he was doing, I think he would have gotten Trump and the Republicans into much more of a corner, just as Roosevelt got the Republicans of his era into a corner. And I think that it would have been dramatically easier for him to unite the Democratic Party, even to talk to a Joe Manchin and a Kyrsten Sinema about moving policy. But I think you had to do that accountability component. They haven't done it up to now. One of the reasons I write my book is as an argument for a correction. And I never think it's too late for accountability. So, I would hope the president would spend some of his waking moments taking a look. He doesn't have to read my whole book, but I wouldn't mind if he did. But what I sure wish was that he would read some of what I was able to unearth about the Pecora Commission and about Roosevelt, because I think there are powerful lessons there in how to move policy and to master a circumstance in history that come from a real focus on accountability.
Well, John Nichols, thank you so much for chatting with me. It was such a delight.
It's been a total honor. And, I will tell you this, if you ever meet an author who isn't delighted to be interviewed by somebody who's read their book, they're a very ungrateful person. I'm grateful to you, and I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. I recommend folks check it out. The book is Coronavirus, Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. Cheers.